Debbie Ginder.
It's the 10th.
Debbie Ginder, February 10, 2007.
So I'm on.
You're on.
You must be a good audience. I do better when I have a good audience. Except I'm telling myself this is not a performance. This is just a
Right.
testimony.
You're just
That's
talking to
right.
This
us.
is sharing, just talking to friends. I didn't know Eleanor Ginder, but yeah, it's time for the tissues.
Get them done early.
I knew when I read the inscription on her grave marker that it was true. It said, God's special agent. And even though I didn't know her, God used her to change my life in ways I could never have started to imagine. But I'm getting ahead of the story. Let's start with Carl. When Carl was 5 years old, he went with his family to the boat dock in Philadelphia and watched as his favorite uncle, Uncle Amos, and his wife Verna got on board the big ship that was going to take them to what was then called Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in southern Africa. As a little kid, Carl got the feeling from his family that this was not a sad thing. This was a really great thing, that God had picked one of them to go far away to share the gospel with people who needed to know it. So it wasn't a sad, mournful time. It was, hooray, God is on the move here, even though we're going to miss Amos and Verna. But less than 9 months later, on Thanksgiving Day, Carl went into the kitchen in his grandma's house. Big old country kitchen in one of these big farmhouses. She had a cook stove that was his favorite place to be close to on cold winter mornings, because he knew if he opened the oven door, it would be warm enough to be cozy, but not hot enough to burn him. So he climbed up onto the oven door and sat there while she was fixing Thanksgiving dinner. But then a messenger came with a telegram, and the telegram said simply, Amos with Jesus, buried same day. That was how they learned that Amos, at the age of 26, had died on the field. He had typhoid fever. Carl heard the sadness in his family, but he heard something more than that. He heard the Spirit of God speak to him and say, you are to go and take his place. He can't explain how at the age of 5 he knew that was the voice of God, but he did. He had enough sense to recognize that, and enough sense not to tell all the grown-ups that God had just told him he was going to Africa and get missionary. In fact, he kept that secret pretty well for several years. But as he began to grow, the Lord confirmed to him that he had indeed heard right on that Thanksgiving morning. And he also learned, this is just a neat thing, that 2 other people were also called to go to Africa as missionaries as a result of Amos's death. So all 3 of them eventually were there. By the time Carl got to college at Messiah, he decided he might ought to tell somebody he was going to be a missionary to Africa and find out how he should train for this. So he went to see the director of missions, and the gentleman said, we need science teachers. So Carl finished his education with a degree in science and was ready to head with his bride, Eleanor, off across the ocean in a little boat to take up where Uncle Amos left off. They loved Africa. It was sort of like coming home for both of them. For 12 years, they were there. The first thing Carl did was get the assignment that he was to build a secondary school. So at the age of 22, he was building a secondary school and serving as headmaster, and then served as superintendent of a mission and several other positions that brought him into contact with lots of people. Their 3 sons were born there, and after 12 years, there was a war going on in the country, and they just felt like God was saying to them, it's time to come home. This is just another neat little aside. The people there were very, very sad that they were going to leave, and they said, we thought you are our family. Why are you leaving us? And Carl said, the children need to be in the shade of their grandfather, Bishop Ginder, which I mentioned a while ago. And immediately, the men understood that, because the word for shade in the Bailey language is the same word that means influence. Isn't that a wonderful picture? Taking them home to be in the shade, the influence of this godly grandfather. So they came back to the United States. Carl didn't have a trembling heart about going to Africa. He had a trembling heart about coming home. And when he got off the plane in Harrisburg, he said it was one of the worst periods of time he had known in his life to that point, because he didn't have an identity here. Over there, people knew him, they knew his character, they knew who he was. He had a job to do. Here, suddenly, who am I and what do I do? And it took a while. Stubborn man that he sometimes is, of course, we wouldn't know anything about that, would we? For God to get through to him, I want you to be a pastor. Eventually, he agreed to become pastor of the Redland Valley Brethren in Christ Church. Do you know it? Steve Lane's there now. It was a little country church of about 65 people. And the one thing Carl knew was that he didn't know how to be a pastor, because he'd never been to seminary, he hadn't been to Bible college, he had a degree in science. And the missions board had forced him to be ordained, don't tell anybody I said that, as a missionary teacher before they would let him go. So he was officially Reverend Carl Ginder with a degree in science. And he knew he didn't know how to be a pastor. So he spent lots of Saturday nights with his face in the carpet, just prone before the Lord, saying, if you don't do something, it ain't going to happen, because I don't have it. And as he yielded himself to the working of his Spirit, God began to do great things in that church. And it doubled in size and doubled in size and doubled in size. And it wasn't just numbers, it was the influence in the community, to the point that on Sunday mornings, there were about 100 young people who filled the front pews of the church. And he said, I knew if I could bring a message to which they responded, the other people would be touched. If I could get to the young people, I could get to the rest of them. Eleanor was a big part of the ministry there. Very gifted musician and teacher and writer. They were just a powerful team for the Lord in their humility and desire to glorify God. After they'd been there about 9 years, Carl sensed that something was wrong. He didn't know what exactly. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew something was wrong. Something was wrong with Eleanor. Something was wrong in the relationship. And he could tell that if something didn't change, there was going to be a wedge that would create a rift within the congregation. So he resigned from that position and took a little pastorate in Petersburg, West Virginia. It was there during a physical storm that the emotional storm also broke. There were torrential rains, and the bridges and the roads that connected their area of the country from the rest of the world were all washed out. Carl and his youngest son, Brian, were at home alone, realizing they had no idea where Eleanor was. There was no way to communicate with the outside world. Phone lines were down, nothing. I think that went on for about 4 days. And at the end of that period of time, someone from state police was finally able to get through to them to say that she had been located and was in a psychiatric hospital in Maryland. Then things started to begin to make a little bit of sense to him. Eventually, after consulting many doctors, he was given a magazine article that a friend had spotted that described a condition. The symptoms matched hers exactly. So Carl actually took the magazine article to her psychiatrist and said, I think this is what we're looking at. And she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. This was in the early 80s. So recognition and treatment of the disease was not nearly what it is today. Her illness was so serious that he soon realized he wouldn't be able to continue functioning as a pastor. It was difficult for him to think about leaving public ministry as a pastor, but he had taken very seriously those marriage vows that said sickness as well as health, worse as well as better. And he knew that his first priority had to be to take care of his wife. So he resigned from that church and became a public school science teacher. Throughout the next 10 years, things were really difficult for the household. One of the characteristics of Eleanor's illness was that she perceived it not to be a disease, but a spiritual issue. And because of her understanding of the husband as the head of the house, she had the feeling that if Carl had been a more spiritual person, the illness would be gone. I'm not saying this in any way to be negative about her, but there's a part of the story that if you don't know that, you miss a miracle. And we don't want to miss miracles, and she wouldn't want us to miss them because they glorify God. So off and on during the 10 years, there were frequent hospitalizations. Sometimes he had to have her committed. And always, when he would go to visit her, she was very angry, blaming him for the hospital stay and for the sickness itself. But in the spring of 1994, she again had to be hospitalized. When Carl went to visit her that day, he expected the same kind of lashing out that he'd experienced before. It was not there. God had done something new, and Carl recognized it as soon as he walked in the room. There was a change in her spirit. And for the first time in those 10 years, she looked at him and said, I understand that I am mentally ill. I know it is not your fault. Thank you for taking care of me. Thank you for being a faithful husband. And from that point, things changed. And the sweetness that had been missing, and the companionship that had been gone, there was restoration there because God is a God of restoration. During that summer, Carl didn't hear Eleanor ever say that she was praying to die. But as he studied her behavior and knowing her as well as he did, he sensed that she was tying up loose ends. And he knew that she was tired of fighting that disease, tired of having a body that didn't work right, and a mind that wasn't always on target. I hear Evan.
I do
He
too.
reads attention. Is he going to come join us?
Yeah, he will a little bit.
Good.
Do you want to continue or?
No,
Yeah, you
wait?
guys
whatever you
can
want to
go
do.
without me.
Okay. Yeah, continue.
She can see it later, right?
Yeah,
Right.
that's right.
So he sensed that she was getting ready to go home. Not that she was suicidal, but she was just weary of this. And it was actually during those few months that she prayed a 3-point prayer that impacted me so personally. And the ripples from that pebble in the pond go far, and much further than we know or will know until we get to heaven. She said to her sister Ava, I know that Carl needs to be in ministry. He can't be in ministry as long as I'm here. I know God is not going to heal me on this earth. I know he could, but I know he's choosing not to. So I am praying for 3 things. I'm asking God to take me home. I'm asking him to bring Carl another wife. And I'm asking God to take them back to Africa. It reminds me so much of the verse where Jesus said, greater love has no man than this, to lay down his life for a friend. And because of her love for God, and her love for her husband, and her love for the people in Africa and around the world, she's willing to say, take me out of the picture, but carry on. I just love that concept that we are a little part of a big, big picture. And it's not so much about us. It's about God and His glory. And that was her motivation. Carl didn't know that. I didn't know that for a couple more years, but God knew that. In December of 1994, on the 19th of December, Carl Eller got a happy phone call. Their second son, Barry, and his wife, Kathy, had just given birth to the first grandchild, Michaela. And so on the night of December 19th, Carl Elner's conversations, they fell asleep, was about that big 11-pound granddaughter that had just come into the family, and how thankful they were for that. The next morning, Carl got up and went to work, as he always did, leaving Eleanor in bed. Her medications were pretty strong, so she usually just stayed in bed for several hours after he left and slept. And then when he came home in the afternoon, she was there because she couldn't drive. But when he came home on the 20th of December from school, he noticed immediately that their van was not parked in the house. That didn't make sense to him because he knew she couldn't drive. He went into the house, called for her, and she wasn't there. He looked all through the house. There was no note, nothing to explain her absence. Her medication was still there. Her glasses were still there. He immediately thought, I wonder if she's having another psychotic episode, and if in her eagerness to see the baby, she has tried to drive herself to Pennsylvania. He doubted that to be the case, however, because usually there were changes in her behavior that would indicate that she was about to get in trouble. So he didn't really think that was happening, but it was all he could come up with. So he got on the phone and started calling family members. Nobody had heard anything from her. Eventually, the family encouraged him to go ahead and call the police to make a report of her as a missing person. So for the next several days, he stayed at home in their little house in South Texas, where he was working as a teacher in the Hispanic community. They had moved there soon after her breakdown in West Virginia, because the climate reminded them of Africa. It felt like home. So he waited there in the hot Texas December, not knowing what to do. December 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, Christmas Eve, no word. 7 o'clock on Christmas morning, there was a knock at the door. It was a police officer who said, we have news of your wife. You need to go to the adjoining town, the neighboring town here, to the police station, and they will give you information. Carl drove himself over. As soon as he arrived and identified himself, he realized this is not good. And he began to be convinced that the thing he had feared the most had actually happened. Because the questions he was being asked indicated she was probably dead and he was a suspect. Things like, where have you been for the last 5 days? Are there people who can verify your whereabouts on the day of her disappearance? Once the officers seemed convinced that he truly had no knowledge about her disappearance, they produced a ring and a watch, which he identified as her wedding band and her watch. Then they asked him to identify her body, which they had recovered the night before on Christmas Eve, locked in their van at the back end of a parking lot in the town. She had been stabbed to death and left there in the van in the hot Texas sun until her body was recovered. So within the course of that hour on Christmas morning, he had been interrogated as a suspect in the Charles wife's murder, identified her decomposing body, and made the decision that he would return her remains to the hills of home in Southwest Virginia for burial. Obviously, he was grief-stricken and stunned by the events that had taken place. But there's also a sense of rejoicing because he knew she was at home where she wanted to be, not in the hills of Virginia, but in the hills of heaven. And that she was at last free from the sickness that had plagued her for so long. So, rejoicing and sorrow can coexist. And they certainly did in him as he tried to make sense of what was going on in the physical while celebrating what was going on in the realm of the spirit. After the funeral in Virginia, he went back home to that very empty house in South Texas, trying to figure out what is taking place. His neighbor, his next door neighbor, had commented to him, "Carl, strange thing has happened. My son has disappeared." This was before Eleanor's body had been recovered. And Carl had said to Mr. Nunn, "That's strange. My wife is gone too." It was some days later that the pieces began to fit together. The police were able to find the owner of a pawn shop. And the owner of the pawn shop said a young teenage boy and girl had come into the shop selling to pawn electrical equipment. And the young man had signed his name on the ticket.
Mm-hmm.
It was the next door teenage boy who was missing. And his girlfriend, the young man I think was 17 or 18 at the time, his girlfriend was 15. What eventually unfolded was that they wanted to get enough money to buy bus tickets to Chicago. No alcohol, no drugs, no personal vendetta. They just wanted enough money to buy 2 bus tickets to Chicago. They knew Carl left for work early and that Eleanor stayed home. So they'd gone into the kitchen at Jamie's house and taken knives from the drawer in the kitchen. They'd gotten rope, a sawed-off shotgun, some tape, and old rags, and waited outside the house, outside Carl and Eleanor's home, until they saw Carl leave for work. They waited just a little while longer, then went to the door and told Eleanor there had been an accident. Carl had been involved in a traffic accident, and they knew where he was and would be happy to take her to be with him. She, in the confusion of her illness, ended up being awakened suddenly from sleep. And knowing this is the next door neighbor who mowed the yard for them when they were away on vacation, had no reason not to trust them. So with the young girl, Maria, driving, Eleanor got in the front seat of the van, Jamie got in the back seat, and as soon as they pulled out of the driveway, he grabbed Eleanor and pulled her into the back of the van. He hit her with the gun. They bound her, went through her purse, got her credit card, and then drove around town for several hours trying to decide what to do next. They eventually went shopping, bought the electrical equipment, and pawned it. Then she would have heard them as they talked about what do we do with her. They decided that they needed to kill her because she could identify them. You can see the level of functioning that they had. I signed my name on the pawn slip. I'm not going to murder this woman because she knows who I am. And all they wanted was enough money for 2 bus tickets. first tried to kill her by breaking her neck. Jamie tried to twist her head until her neck was broke. That didn't work. So they stuffed the rag in her mouth and put tape across her eyes. And while Jamie held her, Maria stabbed her to death with the kitchen. After that, they bought pizza and drove around town for a little while before they went to the bus station, leaving her body locked in the van there in the parking lot. We know that from their confession. They were picked up in Chicago. Carl was able to help the police locate them because Mr. Nunn said to him after Carl returned from the funeral, he said, "By the way, I know where my son is now. He's in Chicago." So Carl went to the police immediately and said, "I think I know who killed my wife, and I think I know where he is." The police said, "We know who killed her, but we don't know where he is." They had reached the same conclusion. Carl said, "This is where they are." So they went and arrested the young people who confessed to what they had done and gave the details. After the funeral, when Carl came back home, being a man of peace, he knew that he could not live a few feet from the family of the young man who had murdered his wife and pretend they no longer existed because they'd been neighbors for several years. So he made the trip over to their home just to say to them, "I don't blame you for what your son has done." Mrs. Nunn was sitting in the chair rocking back and forth like this, grieving the loss of her son and the loss of Eleanor, whom she described as her best friend. But that visit of forgiveness was a healing force in everybody's life. A few days later, Carl looked out the window and saw a woman drive up and get quickly out of the car. She fell to her knees on the sidewalk, crying hysterically. He went out to see what was going on and found it was Maria's mother. He didn't know Maria or her mother, but the lady said, "I just had to come and express to you how sorry I am for what my daughter has done." And again, the